Richard Bamfield, Master of Wine, which means that I try to do far too many different things, but best known these days for my work with Lidl, but I also have clients in other parts of the world, Burgundy, South America, Bordeaux, and I'm very lucky. I organise events, I lead tours sometimes, and I do a lot of tasting. As you know, I have never made my own wine, but I have studied winemaking. I understand the principles, and I can more or less see how that might apply to making wine at home. In its purest form, wine is the produce of fermented fresh grapes. But it's not quite as simple as that. And sometimes you hear winemakers these days say, oh, we just let the wine make itself. They tend not to be the people who are making the best wines. Wine doesn't quite make itself. If you let it make itself, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And so I think there are a number of steps, even when you're at home without specialist equipment, that can probably lead to a more reliable and consistent result.
What they do using yeast, most of them they use sugar. And they were asking if that's okay, sugar or crystal sugar, if you know what they are. What do you think about this process?
It depends at what stage of the process you're using it. If you're picking ripe grapes typically have naturally have a potential alcohol content of 12 to 14 degrees, depending on what level of ripeness you're picking them. So if you're picking grapes of that ripeness, I don't see why you would add sugar, because all you're going to do if you add sugar at the beginning of the process is you're just going to make a wine with higher alcohol, which isn't necessarily a good thing. If you're adding sugar at the end of the process...
By ending the process, you mean fermentation?
After fermentation, then you will end up with a sweeter wine. And that's fine if that's what you want, a sweeter wine. I think that largely depends on personal taste. But certainly in ancient times, I know in Roman times, yes, they used to add honey at the end of the process, because I think if you add a little bit of honey, it helps, because it's sweet, it helps act as a preservative, so it helps the wine keep. And because homemade wines can often have a certain bitterness to them, a little bit of sweetness just balances that out, so the wine tastes better.
What do you think about natural yeast?
It depends very much where you are. I think some vineyards have more natural yeast than others. Some wineries, because you can get yeast inside buildings as well. You can get yeast on equipment, you can get yeast on bottles or containers. So yeast is naturally available in the atmosphere. But my understanding is there are lots of different types of yeast. Most wine producers don't use the natural yeast because they lose control. If you use natural yeast, for instance, some yeasts, bread yeast for instance, once a wine reaches about 8% alcohol, the yeast dies. It can't survive at alcohol levels over 8 or 9%. So for making wine, it's probably not what most people want. It'd be fine if you were making a sweeter wine and you didn't want it too strong, but it's probably not what people want. So I think it does depend what wine you're making, and it probably depends on the condition of your vines and your cellars, and a bit of trial and error, I suspect. By all means, try natural yeast. I think if you've got enough grapes, for instance, you might make one batch where you leave it on its own and see what's happened and see whether the natural yeast exercise their magic. And you might have another batch where you used some bought-in yeast, some cultured yeast. And yeast, I had a quick look at this before I came out to see it, because I think yeast is one of the key areas, because obviously for fermentation to take place, that yeast has to be present to convert the sugars to alcohol. And there's a lot of information on the internet about different types of yeast and how they influence different types of wine and different flavors in wine. and it is true, and winemakers are very aware of this. Some yeast can actually, they do influence the flavour of the wine. So you might say, oh well, we're going to make a wine from Shiraz for the sake of argument, but certain yeasts will subtly alter the flavour of that Shiraz. And again, as I say, winemakers are aware of this.
Can you just explain a little bit more about this favor the grape, when yeast can favor the grape or vice versa? How?
I think that
because we're not adding anything. Some people, they say, oh, when you just say you smell or you the character of raspberry in your wine, have you added raspberry?
Look, I couldn't agree more, and I think we've had this conversation before. I think the language we use to describe wine, frankly, is unfortunate, because I think we do give mistaken impressions to people. And you're absolutely right. People often say that to me. Does that mean people add gooseberries or chocolate or coffee or whatever it might be? No. The answer is generally no. Wine is made from fresh grapes. In its purest form, wine is made from fresh grapes. You may add yeast. The yeast convert alcohol, sugar to alcohol. The yeast, I'm no chemist, but basically you've got primary aromas, which are the aromas of the fresh grapes, and then during fermentation that creates secondary aromas. Certain yeast during fermentation, they will produce these different aromas in the wine, and those aromas will convert to flavour ultimately. So you've got this difference between the primary flavours of the grapes and then the flavours after fermentation, which could be different to the primary flavours. Some of them will stay the same. It's quite interesting. If you eat Cabernet Sauvignon grapes, they do have a bit of flavour of blackcurrant. And even in the finished wine, you can still have a little flavour of blackcurrant. But that's not true of all grapes. And it probably does depend what yeast you use to ferment it. But in its purest form, nothing is added to wine. Maybe yeast, and one subject we'll probably come back to is sulfur dioxide as a preservative.
And then the temperature, controlling the temperature during the process, different process. How can you help them with that?
I think that's difficult. I mean, I think one of the great advantages of using underground amphora or clay pots or something like that is that the temperature is at least constant, and it shouldn't get too hot or too cold, because the soil around or underground, the temperature should be more constant. But it is tricky. During fermentation, the temperature rises, and if you don't check it, the temperature can easily rise to 28 to 30 degrees.
Because of that.
Because fermentation gives off heat. And so and that's good in a way, because if you're making a red wine, it's the heat that extracts the colour from the skins of the grapes. So that heat, to a certain extent, is a good thing. But most winemakers will like to control it. Mm-hmm. And in white winemaking particularly, we forget, but as recently as 60 years ago, there wasn't much white wine made in Spain or Portugal, because they couldn't control the temperature of fermentation. They didn't have stainless steel. It's only really since they've benefited from EU subsidies.
What were they using?
Well, they were using concrete and fiberglass.
Mm-hmm. Is it okay, fiberglass or plastic?
Well, it's okay. To be quite honest, I actually think for home winemaking, fiberglass is probably a realistic option. Not everybody can afford stainless steel tanks, and it might be quite difficult to find small stainless steel tanks. So fiberglass, there's no reason why that's not a bad option. And I think the good thing about, I don't know all its properties, but one of the ways they used to cool tanks, if you were making white wines during fermentation, was they would pour water down the outside. If you poured water down the outside, that would cool the liquid in the container. And I think that does work with fiberglass, that you can cool the liquid inside by pouring water down the outside.
So this is during fermentation.
This is during fermentation, that's right.
When fermentation process is finished, what about then? The temperature should be
So,
still cool.
so generally speaking, at that stage, once fermentation is finished, the temperature of the liquid inside the wine, the finished wine, that will just come down to the ambient temperature. If the ambient temperature is 20 degrees, it'll just come down to 20 degrees, and it'll stay at 20 degrees. And at that stage, I don't think it really matters what the temperature is particularly. You certainly don't want it to get too hot, because I think that would kill some of the natural aromas of the wine. If it gets too cold, it's probably not critical, but ideally you'd keep it within a range of probably 10 to 25, I'd have thought, which should be possible. But at that stage, that's when you probably you may need a little bit of sulfur dioxide, just to make sure that the wine doesn't spoil at all.
Can you explain this a bit?
Well, again, I'm not a chemist, but my understanding is that with wine you get acetic bacteria, and acetic bacteria are effectively what turns a wine to vinegar. So if you're making vinegar, you want the acetic bacteria. If you're making wine, you don't. And you mentioned that some wines can have a sour taste. That's probably because they're turning to vinegar. And one of the ways you protect against that spoilage is by using a small amount of sulfur dioxide. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about sulfur dioxide.
Yeah.
A lot of people think they're allergic to it. They're almost certainly not. It doesn't give headaches. Well, if you're allergic to sulfur dioxide, you'd be allergic to Coca-Cola, mayonnaise, dried fruits, preserves, all of which have higher levels of sulfur dioxide than wine. So I don't think many people are allergic to sulfur dioxide. I really don't. It's taken the blame for headaches. Headaches tend to be caused by dehydration, not sulfur dioxide. So
the sourness could come from that.
So the sourness could come from a lack of sulfur dioxide and the wine beginning to spoil. And this is where I'm a little bit skeptical about so-called natural winemaking, because natural winemakers will say, oh, we'll let the wine make itself and we don't need to use sulfur dioxide. Well, I've tasted a lot of the results, and they would have been much better if they had used sulfur dioxide. It may be natural, that doesn't make it good. And I drink wine for pleasure. It's funny, Anahita, in the very first job I had in the wine business, so I'm going back almost 40 years, I was invited by the local home winemaking society to go and give talks to them. So I'd turn up with 5 or 6 wines. I was working for a wine merchant, and I'd turn up with 5 or 6 wines to taste for them. They weren't interested in my wines at all. They couldn't care less. What they wanted to do was show me their wines. And they'd all come armed with their wines. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. I'd probably taste 20 of these homemade wines from every fruit and vegetable under the sun. Maybe 1 or 2 of them would have been possibly drinkable, but most of them were undrinkable. But there is something, when people have made something themselves, they're quite proud of it. And they can sometimes be blind to the flaws. So it has always made me think I shouldn't be critical if I haven't tried it myself, but I never have.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Let's ask about the color of the wine. So many people, they are complaining that after a few months, even, or a year, the color will...
In red wines, that the color falls out.
Yes, and becomes dull, brownish, or
It's
just
really,
lose its color.
I mean, I think, again, I suspect that comes down slightly to sulfur dioxide.
Okay.
And I think if you're making white wine, naturally tends to get more golden as it ages.
Exactly.
And if you add a bit of sulfur dioxide, it'll slow down that process because it slows down the gradual oxidation of the wine. Red wines, it depends a little bit what grape variety you're making. A lot of grape varieties have very thin skins, and they naturally give wines that are very pale.
Yeah.
They just do. In fact, I think one of the Persian wines we tried was really quite pale, one of the reds. And that's almost certainly because the grape naturally gives wines of that colour. So you shouldn't be disappointed.
Yeah.
Some grapes, like Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot rum, that naturally give wines with a very deep colour. Certainly, some winemakers I know, particularly with Pinot Noir, you may have heard of a cold fermentation a cold maceration pre-fermentation. So when the grapes come into the cellars, you just put them in the container and you chill them and you just leave them there for a bit, probably with a bit of sulfur dioxide, not too much, but a bit of sulfur dioxide. Because if you add too much, fermentation won't start when you want it to.
Okay.
So, but by chilling it, you mean fermentation is unlikely to happen. And by people say that by doing what they call a cold soak, so probably pressing the grapes lightly so that the skins are in the juice, the grape juice, and just leave them like that for 3 or 4 days. That some people say that fixes the color. It helps fix the color, so that what the color there is more likely to stay. Then of course there is a difference. So you can fix the color a little bit with a cold soak maybe. There's a difference between extracting colour when the wine is juice, when the grapes are juice, and extracting colour when it's alcohol. So this is another thing. There are certain things it's not a bad idea to do before there is alcohol in the mix, because it's a gentler extraction. And so doing this cold soak before fermentation, but you do need to make sure it's cold. It does need to get down to sort of 4 to 6 degrees. So refrigeration temperature.
Yes.
Refrigeration temperature would do it. And so that would help. There may be other ways you fix colour, but I'm not sure exactly what those would be, I'm afraid.
Okay.
As I say, judicious use of sulfur dioxide is key throughout the process. And one of the things when I was talking about using the internet, that's where I would use the internet to work out what levels are advisable. And they would say how many milligrams per litre you need to use. So if you've got 20 litres, it would tell you how many milligrams of sulfur dioxide you need to use. You certainly don't want to use too much, because it will kill the aromas and it can make the wine just taste not very nice. But if you use too little, there's a risk of spoilage. So it is a question of getting it. You have to get it. The amount of sulfur dioxide you use, you'll use a certain amount per litre.
Per litre.
Okay, so and then however many litres you've got, you do a simple calculation to work out how much you need. And sulfur dioxide, I mean, winemakers, they can add it as a powder, they can add it as a liquid. I think it can be added as a gas as well, actually, but most home winemakers wouldn't have a gas. I suspect they would add it either as a powder or as a liquid. I think both are possible. I think clarity of wine is a key issue. Most people like the idea of drinking a clear wine, a crystal clear wine. Okay, these days where we drink more natural wine, most natural wines are cloudy. And so we've probably got a bit more used to the idea of drinking wine that isn't crystal bright. Having said that, I think it's quite satisfying if you can produce a wine that's crystal bright. And you can achieve that by two means. One is filtering, but the sort of filter that you require to make a wine bright, it's a very, very small filter, and most people wouldn't be able to afford that for home use, I don't think. So the traditional way of doing it is what they call fining. And you fine there are certain agents you can buy for fining where you mix them with the wine, and because they have an opposite charge to the protein haze which causes the haze in the wine, they bind and it'll all fall to the bottom of the container. Now, fining agents, I should imagine there are some that are quite easily available. There's one called bentonite, which I imagine you can buy as an earth over the internet. It's an earth, if you want, and you add that. I know that sounds a bit strange, but it is what winemakers use. The other one that I suspect is widely available is gelatin.
Okay.
So gelatin you can use as a fining agent as well. Again, the measurements for these, you'd need to research that on the internet to know how much to use per litre of wine. And gelatin's obviously not great if you're vegan. Then you'd probably want to use the earth product. There are some plant-based products that act as fining agents as well. and then you just have to be able to draw the wine off the resulting sediment. But that will help it. That should make a clear product.
Great.
I think with all measurements, whether it's yeast or sulfur dioxide or bentonite or fining agents, anything like that, you need to do your research. You need to make sure that winemaking it requires a bit more care. I think if you're making wine at home and you're making lots of bottles and you are trying to keep them for a year or two, you have got to take it more seriously, because the longer you keep a wine, the more likely it is that something's going to go wrong. And if there are any flaws in the wine, time is more likely to reveal them. So if you are keeping wine for some time, one, you'd certainly need to make sure that you're sterilising your bottles. And if you are using corks, which is fine, just make sure that the corks are sterile as well. And you can always, it's easy to buy corks for home wine.
Steam?
To use
steam for the bottle?
Yeah, that would sterilise pretty well.
Okay.
But there are other, sterilising agents you can find, but steam is probably fine. Yeah, that would do a good job. It is, it's the biggest change in the wine business in the time I've been in the business, is the attention to hygiene. 40 years ago when I went to wine cellars, they were smelly, they were damp, they were dirty, and they smelt musty. They really did smell musty. These days, they're spotless. Most wine cellars. It's the biggest difference, is the attention to hygiene. And I think that's the same with home winemaking as well. We understand the science and the chemistry more these days, so we have to apply that. And a key part of that is cleanliness, sterile environment. You talk specifically about dangerous byproducts.
Yes.
I mean, I don't. Okay. There are some. So first of all, gas. Okay, so fermentation gives off carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide is toxic for humans. So it's why if you're in, say, Burgundy, and it's the harvest time, most of the cellars are underground. So the fermentations are taking place above ground, and the barrel cellars are below ground. So the fermentation is giving off carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It sinks into the cellars, and so the cellars are out of bounds during harvest. You can't go down there. You'll die, basically. You'll asphyxiate if you go down. And you don't know it's happening. It's just gradual, and you realise that there's nothing you can do about it. So generally, during harvest time, you'll see big ropes and signs over the entrances to the cellars saying no entry. So that's a dangerous byproduct, is gas. Okay, carbon dioxide gas. The only time I've heard of a byproduct of fermentation being really dangerous is with spirits, vodka, that sort of thing. So if you don't know what you're doing, if you're distilling spirits, then you can make something extremely toxic, certainly. And we hear stories every year of, particularly in more northerly countries where they distill a lot of their own vodka, of people getting it wrong. With wine, and the other thing is there were scandals. You're far too young to remember, but there were scandals in the 1980s with Austrian wine, for instance. But that wasn't a byproduct of fermentation. So basically, winemakers had been adding a substance called glycol. Now, glycol is a type of alcohol that's used in antifreeze, and they were adding that because it gives a bit more mouthfeel to the wines. But it's pretty toxic if it's added in too much, and they added too much. So that was a serious problem. So, but that's not a byproduct of fermentation. That's just very lazy and very dangerous winemaking. The other thing I was going to touch on is one of the key questions you asked was about additives. And we've talked a little bit about basically the wine being, in its rawest form, wine being a very natural product. You can add sugar, but generally if you add sugar, it'll be at the beginning of fermentation, and it's done to increase the alcohol content of the wine, because it means that there's more sugars for the yeast to convert to alcohol. at the end of the process, wine is difficult, and you might end up with a wine that you think it's just not tasting as nice as I hoped it would. Wine it's complicated, it's difficult. I think that's where I'm not sure I'd advocate adding sugar, but I do think there are, in the way we consume wines, the way I consume wines, if I'm drinking a white wine that I find really just a bit tart, a bit acid, maybe a bit sour, I have no hesitation about adding a little bit of liqueur to it. Adding a little bit of blackcurrant liqueur, cassis, or raspberry liqueur. I make sloe gin at home. I even had a little bit of sloe gin. And that bit of sweetness to a liqueur takes the edge off the wine. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't do that with a grape wine as well. And actually, before bottling, add it to the mix and bottle it with that little bit of added liqueur. It depends what you're doing. If you're trying to produce a pure, pristine product with absolutely no additives, fine, but there may be a risk it might not taste very nice. But if you're trying to produce something that you're really proud of and you want your friends and neighbours to try and like, it mightn't be a bad idea to sweeten a wine a little bit that way, just as the Romans did with honey.
Mm-hmm.
It's an easy way of doing it.